We're grateful for who God is. That list of names given, holy and mighty and all of that, that's just the beginning of things. When Jesus was jousting with the Pharisees, Jesus made it clear to them that when you start talking about me, you're talking about something that surpasses Abraham. Because before Abraham was, he said, my name is I am. In other words, when you open up the book to look at all of the good things that a person can possibly be, mighty and triumphant and awesome and holy, he says that that's just the beginning of it. He had to close.
Who I am, America. I am Dr. SHON NEYLAND from New Orleans, Louisiana. I was born in 1964. And I grew up in a period where we had what's called wards in Louisiana, the 7th Ward. I grew up in the 7th Ward, and the 7th Ward was unique because there were more mixed heritage people, i.e. French, Spanish, African descent. And because it was such a eclectic environment, we had a unique look about us. And that look would also bring with it challenges and troubles because people thought, well, if you're from the 7th Ward, you can pass. Some of the people could pass, quote unquote, for white. And other people had different hair textures. That became a big issue. And so I grew up in an environment where there was a lot of issues around how you look, the complexion of your skin, the texture of your hair, which is a very interesting environment to grow up in. I grew up in a 2-person household. My dad was a longshoreman. My mom worked at a laundromat. My mom was the one who looked European in our family. I didn't realize that, like she was greatly Hispanic and Spanish. She had English descent as well and French descent. And so my dad married her. He was 43. She was 33, her second marriage, his second marriage. And I was the oldest child. And as we grew in a household, I have 2 other siblings, 2 sisters, one 1 year younger than me, and then another 2 years younger than me. And so as we grew up in New Orleans, in the inner city, we recognized that we kind of had it differently than many. It was like we had a privileged lifestyle, if you will. Although I grew up in a shotgun home for the first 10 years, a shotgun home in New Orleans means that the house was straight through. And if you had a gun, you can shoot from the front to the back. Therefore, they call it a shotgun. You had the narrow alleyways, and my grandmother lived next door on my mom's side. But then I found out she really wasn't my grandmother. She was my mom's mother-in-law from her first marriage. But they became very influential in my young life because I did not know who was really my grandmother. My grandmother on my dad's side lived in Gloucester, Mississippi, which is where he hailed from. My dad had green eyes, and he was about, a few shades darker than me. And but his hair texture was almost of that of an Indian. And it was an interesting combination with he and my mom. And when we would go to Mississippi, then I found out that my grandmother was born as a concubine. So in other words, her mother was the slave owner's a concubine. And then hence came my grandmother, Beulah Haynes. And then, of course, she had my dad and his brothers. And I always wondered why many of them came out different complexions. my dad brothers, that is, and some of them were fair skinned, some of them were very light. And I didn't understand that. How could they all be brothers and sisters? Well, it turned out that the genetics of my grandmother, Beulah, was of mixed heritage. Therefore, it was passed down to her children. And so now you get the picture of how I'm growing up in this eclectic environment where the emphasis is on, oh, you think you're better or you think you're less. And there were internal wars within the community. Not only were there internal wars with ethnicity and who you look like and the skin complexion, because that was big in those days. If you were what's called, and many people don't know this, but there was terms like mulatto, which means you were 50-50, half European, half African. Okay. Then there were terms like quadroon, which would have been like my mom, 75% European, 25% African. And then there was octoroon. And octoroon meant you were 1/8 African and everything else, 7/8, you were European descent. And so those became lawsuits in America, the early America, about could you pass and who you would become if you get the rights of a quote unquote white person. And so all of this shaped who I was, I think, growing up, because it was a big deal. The lighter you were, you somehow had more privileges in society. And then I began to understand that as I grew up. Now, even though we were what was considered well off, because my dad earned about $50,000 a year. My mom, in those days, in the 70s, that was big money. My mom earned another up to $20,000. So you're talking a household with $70,000. I was driving my first car when I was 15. My dad said, you have to work. I had a work ethic. He was a workaholic. He passed that on to me. And so I worked growing up. I had to pay for my insurance and he paid the car note. I remember this was about $150 for the car note and about $150 for the insurance. And so he helped me buy that first car, a Ford Granada. And my friends, they thought we were well off, because here I am at 15 years old driving my own car to school. But that did not mean there were no opportunities for drugs in my neighborhood. My cousins, my family became very much inundated in drugs. In fact, they were drug sellers for the neighborhood. Alcohol was prevalent. I lived up to 10 years old, 3 doors down from a barroom. On every corner in New Orleans, I say that, or in the inner city, almost, it felt like, it wasn't every corner, but it was very close to being on many corners. There was what was called a barroom. That barroom, everything would go on: drugs, illicit sex, prostitution, shootings. So I grew up seeing shootings. I saw killings. I saw the police coming through, people running down the alleyways. I grew up in a crime ridden neighborhood. Now, New Orleans, as you know, is in the top 5 today for killings and murder. Baton Rouge. It wasn't like that in those days, but crime was high, murder was high, and murder against ourselves, people who look like us, killing ourselves. So somehow in my upbringing, I got this crazy idea that family is important, from my grandmother and my grandfather who lived next door. And they said, you're going to be different. And then I had what I call a triad, my mom and dad, who had me do the spiritual, where I would be able to get my spiritual foundation. And then I had my aunt and uncle, Marguerite and Edgar, who taught me the practical recreation side of life. So my dad never came to any of my games. My dad didn't do that, but he brought me to church. He taught me work ethic. My grandfather is the one who said, "You're not like everyone else. You're going to be different." And I never knew what that meant until I went to college, and I went to University of New Orleans, and I was on scholastic probation. I mean, I was excelling in high school. I graduated in the top 15. I was think number 13. I was in all AP honors courses. And then finally, when I went to college for engineering, I was on scholastic probation, and a recruiter had come to high school. And I remembered that, and I need to make a change in my life. And I went to the Air Force in July of 1984 after graduating high school in May of 1982. And the rest, they say, is the history. And that was the things that would shape my life for the future. And my story has become an amazing journey. Yes. And so as I entered the military, I was able to change my life. One thing when I was growing up is that when my grandfather, who I found out was actually not my physical grandfather or biological, but he was my grandfather because he's the only grandfather I knew. I neglected to mention that my mom's dad and mom were both deceased by the time I was born. In fact, my grandmother, on my maternal grandmother, died the year I was born in 1964, and my grandfather had died 2 years before that. And he was Guatemalan, some say Cuban. We don't know what he was. He was a mixed heritage once again. And my grandmother on my mom's side, we do know she was Irma Millier. So she was of French descent, and she looked basically French. So again, mixed heritage. And so, but when I was in the military, I never had gotten into drugs. I had never gotten into alcohol. I had never smoked. I know it was amazing growing up in that environment with barrooms and crime and drugs and violence. Somehow I was spared. My cousins were in and out of the prison. Even my sister was affected at one point in her life by the ravaging of drugs. But I chose never to go that route. Somehow God had his hand around me, I believe, and protected me for my destiny. So I went in as an enlisted man, 1984. As I said, I used my ASVAB, that's the test you take to enter, from high school, because I was in all honors courses. I was doing pretty well in high school, like I said. And so my scores were high enough 2 years later to get me in. And I went to England, my first assignment. And this is where the world opened up for me. So I started off enlisted. I was in transportation. My job was to ship items around the world for military importance, almost as if you see UPS and FedEx today. That was my job. But while I was doing that, I went to college, and I continued my college from scholastic probation. I came into the Air Force with 27 hours. And so I continued and worked on it, and I acquired my associates in logistics management. And then I went on to get my bachelor's in industrial technology and engineering from Southern Illinois University. So within quick 5 years of being in the military, I excelled in the military and excelled academically. At the same time, I found my destiny in becoming a minister of the gospel. Although I was unlicensed and all of that, didn't have the education at the moment, in ministry, I had the calling. And so then I began to see how all of this was coming together in my life. and I became an officer. I applied and was accepted in 1991. And so after 6 years and a little more, after being in the military, 1990 rather, I had completed officer training school by February of 91. And so now I am moving forward. I am a lieutenant from the inner city. And the thing about being a lieutenant in the Air Force is, and many people don't realize this, in the early 90s and 90, 91, there were not many African Americans who were officers. We were still living in a time where we were feeling the ramifications from the Jim Crow era up into the 1964 and 1965, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 65. And so things had not changed, but the military, as always, was further ahead than society. But as I grew in the ranks of the military, I realized there were not many people who looked like me. And I became a role model for many of that it was possible. So I was a nuclear launch officer and space operations officer. My wife, Madeline, who I married right after coming into the military, did not want me to become a pilot. My commanders wanted me to be a pilot, but my wife said, no, you'll be gone all the time. Well, I became a missile launch officer, nuclear weapons. I was gone 8 days a week, 24 hours each time. And so it was always the laughing joke. I was gone anyway. And so I went up the ranks, and my career excelled. As an airman, I was up for Outstanding Airman of the Year when I first came in, the 12 Outstanding Airmen. I was the John Levitot Leadership Award winner. So all of these things, John Levitot was a hero in Vietnam, and all of these things just lined up. My career exploded and excelled. And so as my career was trajectorying up, my influence started expanding. And so all of those teachings from my grandfather, from my parents on the spiritual side, my grandfather on the confidence side, believe in yourself. And then my aunt with the nurturing, the recreational side. So it was like this perfect triangle in my life where I was well balanced, and I began to move up, as I said, in all dimensions of my life. We had a family. We had 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy. Today, one is a nurse, one is a dental hygienist, and my son is a hospital administrator. So proud of them as young adults contributing. But then something happened as I continued to move up the ranks. I had the sense of the calling to the ministry. So by 1999, I had started seminary school and got my master's in arts and in my master's of divinity equivalency. So now I went from 0 degrees in 1984 when I entered to 1999, 15 years later, I had 4 degrees. And then I became what's called a chaplain. And then that gave me even more influence and more spiritual influence. And then I started seeing my destiny of what I was to do to help people to be successful. And that's where I changed my trajectory from this technical engineer guy, space operations, to my sole focus was helping people to develop and grow. Then I introduced, or the Lord put on my heart, as I continue to excel in the chaplaincy, move up the ranks, major and lieutenant colonel, all the way to the rank of colonel, I began to realize that all of my upbringing in that eclectic background, in that multicultural background, now will come to fruition for a purpose. And that purpose was to let people know that you can become who you want to be and who you're destined to be, despite what society says about your color or your ethnicity. It's about your character, as Dr. King would often espouse. It's about who we desire to be. And so I began to shift my message about who you are versus about the color of you are. And then I started realizing that this antiquated a separation that we do of white and black is made up. And then I start looking at the connotations of the word. If you're white, and then if you're black, white means pure and holy and righteous. Black means evil, void of color. And then you can look at society, blackmail, black ship, black day, blacklist. If you think of white, you think of the white lie, a doctor's white lab coat. And so I said, we have to move from that in America and become Americans. We have to move from different races, which is a made up social construct, and say, no, we are one human race. And that became my platform. Even as I went to the Iraq war, I went to Afghanistan war, my pledge to America was to bring unity. A divided America cannot stand. And as I began to sound the trumpet, as I began to travel around the world, I ended my career 35 years later as a colonel. And I did not make general. Many thought I should have made general. I felt I should have made general, but then I decided to retire early and become a senior pastor, which is what I'm doing now at Highland Christian Center in Portland, Oregon. But the one thing I'll leave you with is that I had the platform of a lifetime as a colonel in the United States Air Force, a rarity for African descent. And I began to trumpet the voice of reason that we are Americans. I've walked the walk. I've sat in the meetings. I've led in the battlegrounds. I've marched. And I am telling you, we are Americans and we need to become one and stop the division over color lines, because I found out that just because I have more melanin in my DNA does not make me a less of a man. You can become whatever you are destined to become with your effort and with your faith and with your hope. And of course, I leave you with this, that God was instrumental in my career, in this 35-year career that saw me win hundreds of awards and recognized at the highest levels in the Air Force. So I'm proud to be an American. I'm proud to be of African descent. I'm proud to be of a mixed heritage, but mostly I'm proud to be a child of God. Who am I, America? Again, I'm Dr. SHON NEYLAND. I am also an author of the book, The Courage to Stand, A New America. You can Google me, you can go online, you can get this book today. And this book summarizes my upbringing. It summarizes my thoughts on life, where I believe we can change America. We don't want to go back to the old ways in America. We want to make a new America, an America where all people are free, where we all have the rights and privileges in social justice, policing. The law is applicable to all of us, and we all have a right to pursue happiness, and we have a right to create and own businesses, become who we want to become. I am not surprised at the greatness that is happening in America, especially for those of African descent, because all we needed was the opportunity. And as we celebrate Black History Month or African American History Month, I want you to remember that the greatness is inside of you. Don't ever let anyone tell you, based on the complexion of your skin, the darkness or the melanin in our DNA. Every human has melanin. Don't ever let anyone tell you you cannot become. It is not about hair texture, complexion. It's about our character and who we are. Determine in yourself that you are ready to make a difference in someone's life. And if you want to know more about me, get my book. Again, that's The Courage to Stand, A New America, with Dr. SHON NEYLAND. And I am ready for America to change. The killing, the violence, if we have self-esteem, if we believe in who we are, we can stop the self-annihilation, the drug use, the criminality, the absentee from fatherhood. I address all of this in the book. I address the color designation and why I believe we no longer should identify white and black. We should be called humans. We are Americans. We are people of different ethnicities and cultures, and we can respect one another. And so I believe that you and I together can make a difference and create a new and better America. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.
With all the stuff that's going on, we have to remember that Isaiah 54:17 tells us, no weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord. Even though we've got COVID going round, we ain't gonna let it break us down.
Ain't gonna let.
We gotta trust in God to see us through. There's nothing too hard for him to do. No, 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 no.
Put more on you than you can bear.
No, 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 no.
And no weapon shall prosper.
No weapon.
He'll put more on you than you can bear.
Than you can bear.
And no weapon shall prosper. People are dying, politicians turning their heads.
Ain't that a shame?
Who has the answer? Is it blue or is it red? The answer is Jesus. He's got it all in his hand.
All in his
Put
hand.
your trust in him and you'll be able to stand.
No, 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 no,
Than you can bear. No more on you than you can bear.
No,
And
no, no,
weapon
no,
shall
no, no,
prosper.
no.
No weapon.
No weapon.
On you than you can bear.
Then you can bear.
And no weapon shall prosper. It doesn't matter what you're going through. Just give it to Jesus. He knows what to do.
Know that Jesus, he's covering you with his blood, with his blood.
Shall prosper. It shall not prosper
Shall
against
prosper.
you.
No, no, no,
You
no.
know. No weapon.
No weapon.
No, it ain't gonna work. It ain't gonna work. Hey,
It ain't gonna work.
No weapon.
It doesn't matter.
Formed
It doesn't
against
matter what
me.
you're going
On
through.
you shall prosper now.
No, no, no.
It won't work. It won't
No,
work.
no.